Hi everybody, welcome to A Course in Miracles Applied. Today's topic is called, or we're going to talk about the connection between the characteristics of God's teachers and guilt. At first glance, there is no connection, right? But if we dive a little deeper, as we will do, we'll see that there's a pretty substantial connection to our belief in guilt when it comes to the 10 characteristics of God's teachers. This is based on the section 4 in the manual for teachers, and the section is called What are the characteristics of God's teachers? We did one segment a while ago that talked about the first characteristic, which is trust, and especially we talked about the development of trust. So that's kind of a reference point to this one. This one goes in a little bit of a different direction, but ends up in the same level, which is guilt. Anyway, so as you all know, and as we course students all know, the terms that Jesus uses in the course are different from what we understand them to be, right? He talks about atonement and all the Christian terms. Heaven is different than we have known before. Forgiveness is very different. Prayer is very different. So he gives words that we have used in a certain way a completely different meaning. And the same really happens in the characteristics of God's teachers. And in this case, there are 10 of them. And I put them here on the board. And as an exercise before we start, I invite you to kind of loosen your definition of them for this time we're together, right? Trust, we have a certain way of describing or defining trust, which is not the trust that Jesus talks about. It's the same word because he wants to convey something to us with those terms, but the meaning is completely different, right? Honesty is completely different in here than we have used it before. We are using it. The same for gentleness, joy, and all the other words, all the other terms that he uses. Defenselessness is very different. Generosity, patience, faithfulness, and open-mindedness. So all those terms, if you can let them go and let them kind of hover in space without trying to attach our old meaning to them, then we can kind of go from the other side and fill it with a new meaning that makes sense within this segment of the manual for teachers. So when we start, an interesting thing is just from the get-go, and he talks about that a couple of times. He uses advanced teachers of God, right? Most of the time he says teachers of God, but once in a while he uses advanced teachers of God. And I believe that all those terms we see here are characteristics of the very advanced teachers of God that have gone beyond the ego thought system. What we usually do as students, and I can speak for myself, when I first started with the course and I read the 10 characteristics, I tried very hard to get there. And partially I thought, oh, I already have that. I already trust God, right? The longer we work with the Course, the more we realize that this is just a surface judgment that we place onto that section, and that we, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, we don't know what trust is, right? We connect it with something worldly, right? I trust that I have enough money, or I trust that I'm guided in a certain way, right? That again has nothing to do with the trust that Jesus talks about in the 10 characteristics, right? And the same goes for all the other terms, right? We believe, we know what honesty is, right? And Jesus says this is honesty that you think has nothing to do with the honesty, and the same for tolerance, gentleness, and all the other terms. So just as an exercise to leave the definition for those words blank for a little bit, if it's possible, right? The other thing that is evident is, and that ties into that, is that we have the wrong mind and the right mind here on the board, and all those terms are right-minded terms. So we cannot use them at all within the wrong-minded box here with the ego, right? The ego has those terms playing for the other team, right? The ego has used those terms here for its own purpose, which is to bind the Son of God in this world and in this identity as this person, as this figure in the dream, right? That is the purpose of those terms within the ego thought system. And for the purposes of this segment and in general, I always think it's good to acknowledge that, okay, I'm probably 99% of the time in my ego, because that's where the learning happens. If I tell Jesus I'm 50% over here, then that 50% I'm closing my mind up to his. So I think it's better if we're in the process of getting home with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, it's better to say, all right, it's likely that I'm 99% of the time in my ego, 99.99% of the time in my ego. It doesn't hurt us. It just, that makes us not fall into the trap of denying something or pushing something under the rug, right? And we're like, oh no, I'm with the Holy Spirit, when we're not. So if we just can say or internalize that we are most of the time most likely with the ego, otherwise we wouldn't need this course, we would be at peace, we would be with Jesus, we would feel the presence of everybody, of all of our brothers within us. If we don't have that, we are here, right? So it's good to acknowledge, okay, I'm probably most likely in my ego, and then that's what we can work with. So we are most likely using those terms for the purposes of our ego. And we're going to get to that, how we do that. The other thing I think I want to express is that Jesus does not think we should try to implement those terms in his way. What I'm trying to say is, he knows we're not gentle. He knows we're not honest, right? He knows we have no trust in him, and he says that in the text. He says, "My trust in you is much larger right now than yours in me, but it will not be like that forever. It'll change." Right? His trust in us is much bigger than our trust in him. Our trust in him is very, very small. it cannot be big trust. And we'll get to why. We cannot trust Jesus in our current state. If we believe we are this figure in this dream, we cannot trust Jesus. We cannot be honest. Right? Honesty does not exist. The honesty that Jesus talks about does not exist in the ego thought system. We cannot be tolerant, because the tolerance the ego uses is tolerance for something bad. Somebody has some flaw and we are tolerant enough to tolerate that behavior. And some people come to us and say, oh, you're a saint, right? We're tolerating a negative thing. That's what the ego says is tolerance. Jesus says this is not tolerance, this is tolerance to destroy. That's what he would say if we would go with the Song of Prayer when he says, when he talks about forgiveness to destroy. Tolerance to destroy is, we believe there's something we have to be tolerant about, right? Defenselessness, generosity, patience. We cannot be patient. If we're patient in the regular sense of the word, it is patience to destroy. Patience, the patience of the right mind, is pure love. It's outside of time. The Course says in the text, only infinite patience can bear immediate results. The terms here are not ego terms. We have used them as ego terms, but Jesus in the handbook for teachers, in this section, takes those words and completely turns them upside down and opens them up into a much, much larger space. Above the battleground, all those terms can only be implemented above the battleground, not in the battleground. There is no faithfulness in the battleground, in the ego thought system. There cannot be generosity and such, open-mindedness, right? So those are just some general thoughts. Now, I want to quickly go through this chart over here. We've done it many times, but I wanted to kind of arrive down here and for us to realize why we cannot establish this in our current state, and why working towards it doesn't work. If we have an intention and say, I want to become more trusting, or if we have an intention that says, I want to become more honest as the Course defines it, or I want to be more joyful, or I want to be more generous, or defenseless, or patient, right? We're trying to go towards that, and we're going to go through this now and realize why this is completely, it stops us rather than moves us forward on our journey. So those terms here are the right-minded expression of the oneness of heaven, right? The oneness of heaven is not here. We have no concept of oneness, of love, of God, and of heaven, of Christ, because our mind was made to blot it out. So we have no concept of it. This is a right-minded expression of that. It is not it, but it is an expression of it, right? It's like the notes of the song. Yeah, those are individual notes, and they are part of this big song of oneness in heaven in our mind. So, into eternity, where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh, right? There was the tiny mad idea that said, oh, there's more than God, right? There's more than the oneness of heaven. There's more than eternity. There's more than everything. And for 1 second, we as this fragmented Son of God said, oh, really? And the ego at that moment was born, the start of individuality and separation. And the ego cannot live without our power, right? We give our power, the power of the Son of God, to the ego. The ego cannot live without that power. So the ego comes up with a story, and that story is our story, and that is the story of our sin, right? We have sinned against God because we have shattered. Not only is the tiny mad idea possible, but it has actually happened. It is real, and you are now an individual, but you cannot be an individual if oneness exists. Both cannot exist together. We can't have the whole pie plus a little piece of the pie. It's either a whole pie or it is a separated pie from a little piece, an what do you call it? An incomplete pie and a little piece. That together makes the oneness, but you can't have both. So you being an individual, the ego says, has shattered the oneness of heaven, and you have killed God. What follows that the ego tells us this is a sin is a tremendous amount of guilt. And we have to realize the ego's goal in this is to bind our power to it, right? Without our power, it is nothing. So it wants our power, and in order for us to stay with the ego, to stay 100% identified with the ego, it must come up with this story that makes sure we're not leaving it. We're not going back, right? So this guilt is, as the Course says, this sense of guilt is so acute it has to be projected out. We're in the mind, we're projecting this guilt onto God, right? We're attacking God. We believe it is possible to attack God. So we give all this guilt, all this sin, we give this murderous part of us that we believe we are to God, and now we are afraid of God. The fear of God is born in that moment, right? And then the ego says, you cannot escape this fear within the mind. The mind is here, right? Oh, you can't see that. Sorry about that. The mind is this area with sin, guilt, attack on God, and the fear. That's the mind of the ego, right? And the ego says you cannot escape this wrathful, vengeful God in the mind. He's too strong and too powerful. You must flee the mind. So this fear makes us shatter and multiply and subdivide into billions and billions and billions of pieces. We make the world, and we now are in the world identified with a figure in this dream, with one character in this dream, right? And that identification extends to everything around us. Right, we're identified with our career, we're identified with our love life, we're identified with our body, we're identified with relationships, we're identified with money, we're identified with world groups in world leaders or political figures and whatever it is, rock bands, right, singers. The Course says identification is salvation. For the ego, for us with the ego, identification is salvation, because we believe the moment we're identified with something in the world, we are safe from going back to the mind. That means the ego's goal has been reached. The decision maker, the Son of God, is now fully fledged, identified with this world 100%, with this body, with this story, right? Of this dream figure, 100% identified, but not just for its own good, but to be safe from this wrathful God that is waiting in the mind, as the ego says. And we can't forget that. We cannot, just as I said many times, you cannot simply go into Mordor, right? You cannot simply go and disidentify from the ego. Just say, oh yeah, no, I can disidentify from this world. Or we ask ourselves, why can't I disidentify from this problem? Why do I have this addiction, right? Why do I have this issue? Because we believe this issue is our salvation. It's not a little thing. We can't downplay it. We shouldn't upplay it either, but we should see what it is, right? We are identified with the world, with the body to a full extent, 99.9% of the time, because we believe this is our safety net. We will die without identification with this world, right? So we are now the Holy Son of God, and Jesus says that, how long, O Holy Son of God, how long will you keep this going, right? This belief. We are at the bottom of the ladder, totally identified with the world, as a victim of the world, as a victim of circumstances, down here, right? And as this entity, we're now reading the Manual for Teachers and the 10 characteristics. Not realizing that from this point here, we cannot switch over. We cannot switch to the right mind. We can do it once in a while, but we can't have it lasting, right? Because of this identification is so strong, we first must go back up the ladder. Separation led us down, as the Course says, with Jesus, retracing our steps from sanity, which is up here in the mind, and then over here to the insanity of the ego's mind, into the insanity of the world, which is nothing but an expression of the mind. Right? So we have to go up the ladder. Separation led us down with Jesus, or with the Holy Spirit, which is a part of us. Right? There's a part of us that stayed connected to the oneness of heaven, that is, as the Course says, the voice for God. That is part of us. We are that voice, but we have no contact with it because we are so deep in here. We don't even know that we have a mind. Even studying the Course for decades, we still get annoyed by something that's happening in the world. We get excited about something. We get anxious about something. That is the mindlessness of the ego that says the world decides for you. You don't make that choice. And that is the ego's final goal, right? And in this state, we cannot even begin to have any real concept of what those terms really mean, right? And Jesus tries to describe them, but they're not crystal clear, like, oh my God, yeah, this is what he means. Because we are so identified with this, we have veiled the meaning over here on purpose, right? So we're reading this and it is veiled to us. We don't quite get what he means, right? And the purpose of this segment today is to look at it with one lens that makes at least parts of it and as a whole hopefully clear, right? I took some bits and pieces from what Jesus says and put them into the kind of pattern of this, so we can see what this is and why we're not there and how to get there. Right? So if we start with trust, and we're not going to go through the stages of the development of trust, but if you realize that, and Jesus says that the trust is the number one item of those 10 characteristics. All other 9 are the foundation for the other 9 is trust, right? Without trust, none of the others is possible. So having said that, what we just said, that we are here, we believe we killed God, we're fleeing, we are auf der Flucht, as the Germans would say, right? We are fleeing into the world, trying to blot out that guilt that is waiting in the threshold of our mind, right? And from that point here, how can we possibly trust Jesus and our brothers, right? How can we trust them when we're here? fully identified as a body because we're so afraid of God, we feel so tremendously guilty. There can be no trust because we believe Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and this course will lead us in the end to a, as the course says, to a nameless precipice and throw us over. And if you don't believe that, you should go deep within and ask Jesus what your relationship is with him or with the Holy Spirit, and ask the question, do I really trust you? And eventually we have to come to the conclusion, I don't. Because if we would trust him, and that's what Jesus says, this is the foundation for all the others. If the trust is there, all the others will follow immediately. It's like it's a light switch and the whole thing comes on. Right? How can we trust Jesus and the Holy Spirit or God if we believe on the deepest DNA level that we have shattered the oneness of heaven because we're an individual? And now he's waiting in the mind for us because we have attacked him. We believe the attack on God is real, it's possible. We fled down here. How can we possibly trust him? And the reason we cannot trust him, the code word, right? Is our guilt. We feel so guilty about this alleged destruction of heaven that this guilt prevents us from trusting Jesus. Right? So in one sense, he tries to get through to us with those 1,200 pages of right-minded instructions, knowing full well that we're so guilty that we won't trust him to do what he says. Right? That is how airtight the ego thought system is. It is only possible to get out of the ego by looking at it from a completely different vantage point. From a very different vantage point, we look at the ego with Jesus, and that is what gets us out over time. Right? Within the ego, there's nothing we can do. And part of the ego's curriculum for us, because we now have the course, and the ego says, oh shoot, now the course is there, so all right, let's just use the course for the ego's purposes. So it takes those 10 characteristics and makes them spiritually doable. The ego says, okay, you can be patient, you can trust God, you can do trust exercises, right? You can get rid of your health insurance if you want, right? All those things. You can be generous, give away your money, or all those terms, right? So it tries to get onto the train with us that goes towards this. And Jesus just asks us to be vigilant, right? To be vigilant about what we truly want, what we truly wish for. So the guilt prevents us from trusting Jesus. And when Jesus talks about the development of trust, right? When we have those 5 or 6, the 6 stages, basically what this is, the first 4 stages, or there's one that's a little bit better, but 1, 2, 3, and then 5 are pretty stark, right? And those phases are there to work through that guilt in one way, shape, or form. To look at this guilt and to question it with Jesus, to work through it, to let it come up. Don't push it down anymore. It comes up. It takes a while. We look at it. we move through it. The next thing comes up, we move through it with Jesus, and that is our curriculum for a while, right? So the development of trust is basically, if you want an umbrella statement, is us working through that belief that we're guilty. We might not be aware that we killed God. Nobody is, right? But we might be aware of selfishness, for example. That's part of it, right? So we work through this guilt with Jesus. That's a big part of the course's curriculum. As long as the belief in sin is upheld by us, we cannot possibly trust Jesus or the Holy Spirit. So if we say we trust him, where is that trust? Is it here? Then it can't be trust. If it's here, then it's such trust that is full-blown, all-encompassing love. Once we're here, those terms are one term. They're no longer separated terms. They're separated terms only because the ego uses them. If they're used in the right mind, once we're fully in the trust of the Holy Spirit and the journey is over, all those change into love. Right? So trust with guilt and trust cannot go together. So, and that's why this is the symbol is guilt equals no trust, right? If we talk about honesty, for example, it says in paragraph 2 of the honesty section, it says, the peace of mind which the advanced teachers of God experience is largely due to their perfect honesty. It is only the wish to deceive that makes for war. Conflict is the inevitable result of self-deception, and self-deception is dishonesty. Right? So we have self-deception, we have war, we have conflict and deception. And this is all here. This is all because we believe we are guilty, and guilt is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable when we are guilty, because guilt is so acute, we have to project it outward. And the moment we project our guilt outward onto the world, we are in conflict with the world. Not because of the world, but because of our guilt that we have given it. So that's why peace is impossible without honesty, and honesty is the lack of conflict. But we cannot now not have conflict, because we must project our guilt onto the outside world. So we attack the outside world, and that's the conflict. And then we see the conflict in the Middle East, right, between Israel and Gaza and Palestine. But the conflict is in our mind. This is our guilt that we project onto the world. That is the conflict. And then the ego says, yeah, that's fine, but the conflict is out there. And Jesus asks us to come back and say, no, the conflict is in me. And the conflict is between me and God, that I believe I have destroyed the oneness of heaven. That's why I'm so guilty. I must push it out, and the conflict is outside. And that is why there cannot be any honesty if there is guilt. Honesty is impossible if we believe in guilt. And a very good worldly expression of that is if you have a partner in a relationship, the dishonesty always comes from guilt. Right? Without guilt, there would be no lies. If I wouldn't feel guilty about something, I would tell the truth. I can only be dishonest if I feel guilty. So that works in the world down here and up here in the mind, right? I cannot be honest if I feel guilty. It's impossible, because I always hide something. I hide the guilt. I hide the thought that I killed God, that I'm responsible for the shatter, for the destruction of heaven. And that guilt I'm hiding from everybody. So the honesty and guilt do not go together. Tolerance. If you read the first sentence in the tolerance paragraph, it says God's teachers do not judge. So us, as we are not advanced teachers of God, we're on our way, right? We judge all the time, because the judgment makes sure the guilt is on the outside. And while I believe in my own sin, I must be in the ego and I must be in a judgmental mode, because the judgment, just like identification, is my salvation. If I see the sin outside and the judgment makes sure that the guilt is outside, then I'm safe. So tolerance. The tolerance really Jesus talks about is all-encompassing love. Tolerance disappears when we're in this loving state of the Holy Spirit, because we don't need to be tolerant. The tolerance is then love for everything, for every circumstance. Whatever anybody does matters not. Our response is always loving. But we can't do that because our need to attack. Jesus talks about the imagined need to attack. We cannot answer the call for love in our brother because of our imagined need to attack. Let me see if it says in chapter 12, there's nothing to prevent you from recognizing all calls for help as exactly what they are, except your own imagined need to attack. Right? So we must judge if we're here. We must judge if we believe we attacked God. Judgment is our salvation, because that says the guilt is outside. Whew, God will not get me. He will get the other guy. Right? So we cannot be honest. I forgot tolerance here. We cannot be tolerant with guilt, with the belief in guilt. While we uphold our belief in sin, tolerance is impossible. I'll put this on here. Sorry, I forgot tolerance. I wonder what Freud would say to that. Right? Tolerance. So I must judge to get rid of the guilt, which means the guilt is responsible for me not being able to be tolerant. Gentleness. The first sentence of gentleness is harm is impossible for God's teachers. Harm is the opposite of gentleness in those two paragraphs, right? It says in paragraph 2, it says, therefore God's teachers are wholly gentle. We cannot be gentle with ourselves or others if we believe we are guilty of having destroyed the oneness of heaven and are now utterly afraid for our life. We cannot do that. There's a sentence in this chapter 6. It says, chapter 6, section 3, paragraph 3, sentence 6. It says, without anxiety, the mind is wholly kind. Without anxiety, the mind is wholly gentle. Gentle is just the expression of the kindness, right? Without anxiety, the fear of God, the mind is wholly kind. So the gentleness that he talks about can only be after we have completely ditched our belief in our own guilt. Then we can be gentle. Before that, gentleness is simply not possible except when we move from here through those steps upward and then make a decision for the Holy Spirit. Then we have all those. Of course, then we're connected to the source, which means trust becomes love, honesty becomes love, tolerance becomes love, gentleness becomes love, all those, right? But in order to get here, we first must look at this guilt that prevents us from all this. And then in sentence 8 in the gentleness, paragraph 2, he says, "The might of God's teachers lies in their gentleness, for they have understood their evil thoughts came neither from God's Son nor his Creator." Our evil thoughts are the cause for our evil thoughts is guilt. Without guilt, there's no evil thoughts. Right? So the belief in guilt is the cause for no trust, no honesty, no tolerance, no gentleness. So in one sense, we don't have to work towards trying to do all this, because that's there. Right? What we need to do is look at the guilt with Jesus and the Holy Spirit. That's always the only thing we need to do in this whole course, is look at the guilt with the Holy Spirit. Because the guilt is the cause for everything that follows. Without guilt, there's no attack on God. Without guilt, there's no fear. There's no fragmentation. There's no world. And there's no identifying with the world. We're only identified with the world because we feel so guilty. That gives us one single focus. The ego is very good at making everything extremely complicated, and the ego says, oh, this course is so complicated, right? It's complex, right? But it comes down to one single thing, which is our belief in guilt. Joy, I mean, that's pretty clear, right? Joy and guilt don't go together. I've never been joyful if I felt guilty, right? This is like the opposite. And he says, for example, in paragraph 1, the gentle have no pain. Pain is guilt. The gentle have no pain, they cannot suffer. They are sure they are beloved and must be safe. So safety, love, cannot suffer and cannot have pain, right? But if we believe in our own guilt, we know we can't be safe because we're afraid of God. We're suffering because we're in pain. This is an utterly painful state to have this guilt, right? It is so acute, we have to get rid of it, the Course says. We know we are beloved. We can't know that if we believe we're guilty, right? And we cannot be safe ever, the ego says. The only time you can be safe, the ego says, is when you're fully identified with the world, with a persona that doesn't even know the mind exists. You're just on autopilot, right? That's the only place where you can be safe. And then we ask, as the decision maker, we ask the ego, yeah, but what if I die? And the ego can't answer that question. But what it can do is obliterate the question. So we don't think about it. We think about it maybe 6 months before our death. We start thinking about, wait a minute, what's going on, right? And then we're so in panic. That's why Ken always said the best preparation for death is to do the course. Because by then we'll know what's going on, why we're not afraid of death, we're afraid that God will get us. We're afraid of losing our identification in the world and be back in the mind where God awaits, right? So everything comes down to one single belief, which is the belief in sin and the following tremendous amount of guilt that we have, that we believe in. It's a belief. It's not a reality, right? So there's no joy with guilt and guilt. Defenselessness, the defensiveness comes from a sense of danger, right? The whole world is a massive defensive structure. We defend first against the guilt to keep the guilt in place, and that itself is a big defense mechanism against the love that is there. That is the only reality in this world, right? So defenselessness cannot happen while we uphold this belief in guilt. We must defend ourselves. And then Jesus says in the paragraph, it is not danger that comes when defenses are laid down. It is safety, it is peace, it is joy, and it is God. But we can't lay down those defenses. We can, little by little, but parallel to that, we must look at the guilt with Jesus and recognize in small increments that guilt might not be justified. Right? If his presence in our mind is real, there was no separation. If there's no separation, there's no sin, there cannot be guilt. So our relationship with Jesus or the Holy Spirit is that medium through which we can establish, after working with the Course for a while, that we might not be guilty after all. The same is for the next one, number 7, generosity, right? Generosity is the opposite of lack. If I'm lacking something, I can't be generous, right? That makes total sense. If I lack money, I can't give out money, right? If I lack love, I can't give out love. So Jesus says in the first chapter or two, he says sin can be redefined as a lack of love, right? So if we believe we are sinful and guilty, that is a lack. And if we are lacking something, what we're lacking is the peace of God, right? Because we believe we destroyed it. And if we are lacking something, we cannot be generous, right? It's impossible to be generous if we believe we have shattered the oneness of heaven. It is simply not possible. We can't give away we can't give peace to somebody else if we don't know we have it, and we can't know we have it while we believe in our own guilt. Number 8 is patience. The patience is one that, as we discussed in the beginning, patience is being used by the ego, probably the most of all those, right? Is patience. I'm patient with you, even though you're terrible, or you're acting out. I'm still patient, right? I was always so patient with you while you went through your stuff. The ego says, the Course says the ego, it doesn't matter when the ego retaliates, eventually it will, right? Because that's what the ego does. So patience with the ego is just waiting for that right time to just stick it to them, right? And we all know how that feels. So when Jesus says in the first sentence, those who are certain of the outcome can afford to wait and wait without anxiety, right? Can we wait without anxiety if we believe we killed God? No, right? Anxiety is just a weak expression of this utter terror that we feel because we believe we have shattered the oneness of heaven, right? So there cannot be patience while we ourselves think we'll never get home. We can only have patience if we know we will get home someday. Because then whatever happens in this world doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. As the Course says in the For They Have Come section, what is 1,000 and another 1,000 years? What is 10,000 years? Right? If you're waiting in the patience of the knowledge that the end is certain, the outcome is certain, right? We're one with God already. We just have to wake into that awareness. But we cannot know that while we believe we are so guilty in our mind. So patience is impossible if the belief in guilt is upheld. Patience is impossible with ourselves and others. And the patience that Jesus is talking about is the eternity level patience. That Jesus can be outside of time and wait what we believe is 1,000 years, and for him that's nothing, right? That's patience from the right-minded perspective, because all this is outside of time. Patience is not a term within the time. It is outside of time. Faithfulness is the consistency of honesty. It doesn't deviate, right? It is 100% set on this one thing, which in the right mind is the love of God, right? There's full faith in the love of God. And faithfulness can only come from that, right? Faithfulness, as the Course says here, combines in itself the other attributes of God's teachers. So faithfulness is everything until that point is included in faithfulness. And right now, we are faithful to the ego because we are faithful. We are truly, and we have to really realize that we're truly faithful to that we believe we have destroyed oneness. That's where our faith is right now. And Jesus says, look at that with me. Don't deny it. Don't spiritualize it. Don't make it smaller. Don't say, no, I'm faithful to Jesus, right? I'm faithful to God and this Course. It's much better for our progress with this Course to say, listen, I'm probably not faithful at all. I know I'm not faithful to Jesus 99% of the time. I'm faithful to my ego, right? And that's what Jesus wants. That moment of honesty to say, I'm not faithful, right? I cheat on Jesus 23 hours and 59 minutes a day. And that's what we need to bring to him and say, look at this with me. I'm cheating on you almost 24 hours a day. And there's one moment when I'm not cheating, I forget right after. Because I don't want to be with you. I want to be with the other guy. I want to be with this guy. Because I'm so attracted to this guilt here that I can't even fathom spending more time with you over here. And that's what he wants to hear. That's what heals. It's for us to realize where we are, and then we can go back, straight back to the core, to the cause of this, which is our belief in guilt. And that is what Jesus can look at with us. That's his only function, is to look at our guilt. Everything else is just for us, we need a little fluff, right? But at the very core of the Course and the curriculum with the Course, his presence is the negation of guilt. Period. If he exists within our mind, if his presence exists within our mind, there cannot be guilt because separation has not happened. That's why we need him and look with him onto this guilt. And this guilt is the cause for all of this. So we don't have to work on this. What we can work on is look at it and say, wow, I am so far away from all of this. I can't believe it. I can't believe I'm still not trusting you after 30 years, right? And he says, I believe you. You can't trust me while you believe you're guilty. And while you're in your ego, you must believe you're guilty. So come to me and look at this with me. And over time, that's what gets you out. This disidentification from the ego happens when we look at the ego with Jesus or the Holy Spirit. But it's not enough just to look. We must recognize the purpose of it. What is it for? What is this guilt for that I'm giving this other person? What is it for? The purpose of this guilt is important, because the purpose of giving the guilt away is because I'm so afraid of God. I need to push out that guilt because the ego told me God hunts only the guilty ones. So I cannot be, under any circumstances, be caught as the guilty one. That's why I must project out. Right? So looking at the ego in all its aspects with Jesus is the solution. And the open-mindedness as the 10th characteristic is basically, that's the clearest for me to realize it's impossible to have that if we're with the ego, because we're closed mind. We don't even have a mind, right? We have no mind. We're identified with the body. We cannot be open-minded while we believe in guilt. It is impossible, empirically impossible. We can pretend we're a little open-minded to certain ideas, but we're still very, very much close-minded when it comes to our guilt. We don't want to let this go. Because the ego says, without that guilt, you will be destroyed. Because the guilt is what shields you from the love. And the love is where God awaits, and he will take back the life that we stole from him. So my point with this segment and with the whole channel is to realize really in many, many different ways that guilt is the problem. And if we zone down on guilt, and we see this throughout the course, if you look at this and say guilt is the problem, and you read those 10 characteristics, it'll be very clear why we can't implement those. Be crystal clear. If we realize that guilt is what prevents us, our belief in guilt is what prevents us from accepting this over here. All right, I think we're good for now. I hope this helped, and I will see you next time.